So one of the representations in an M&A purchase agreement that often generates a healthy amount of negotiation is a representation around compliance with law. And this tends to be a representation that's relatively short, often just a sentence, saying something to the effect of the target company has not engaged in any activity that would cause it to be in violation of law, period. That's the entire representation. And what's interesting here is the word law in that sentence will then be defined very broadly. It will cover federal, state, and local laws. It'll include statutes. It will include court orders and court decisions. It will include regulations and commentary on those regulations, and a host of other sort of quasi legal concepts. And it's very likely that any operating business may have inadvertently tripped over something that falls in that definition of law. So this creates some tension between a buyer and a seller. The buyer has put this particular representation into the agreement on purpose as sort of a catch-all. They're just throwing a net out there and saying, hey, there's stuff we don't know about. And if there's anything out there that falls within this broad category, we're going to catch it up here. And if it turns out that it's a problem later on, it's going to be seller's problem, not ours. And meanwhile, a seller looks at this and doesn't want that exposure. They want sort of clarity and freedom on the other side of the transaction. And so in order to have that kind of freedom, the seller is going to want to limit their exposure on this as much as possible. They might try and add a materiality qualifier. They might try and add a knowledge qualifier. They might try and add a time limit on this. All things that we've talked about in other videos about ways that we can sometimes, sort of cordon off the scope of a representation and warranty. And they may also try and limit which laws and which topic areas within the law are covered by this broad rep. If we have specific representations in the agreement on, say, environmental law or employment law, that already cover whether there's compliance in those areas, we might try and carve those out of this broad rep and say, hey, those other specific reps cover that area. And so this isn't another bite at that same apple. And so there's a lot of tension often that develops between the buyer and the seller around the scope of this representation. But it winds up being an important tool for issues that arise after a transaction has closed because of the potential breadth and scope of this rep.